Well, it looks like we got a quorum, so we'll go ahead and get started. I apologize for not being able to write anything on the board, and I would ask that people only ask left-handed questions today because I can't answer anything right-handed. I got into an argument with the boom on a sailboat, and boom won, and I lost. Anyway, my name is Mike. Our group is called flyonspeed.org. Everything that we do is open source, and we share all the information we have freely. We'll talk about what our mission objectives are, but everything is on our website at flyonspeed.org. Next slide. So we're made up of a bunch of volunteers and folks that have retired from the military, and engineers and other folks that are interested in aviation that have the right technical background. And what we try to do is provide training and technical resources to the community. So we don't build anything per se, we don't sell anything per se, we simply publish all the results of our work, and we are always interested in partnering with anybody out there that wants any of the software or physics or technology that we have available. And most of the work we do, by the way, is not even original work. The military's been doing this stuff for about a half a century. So we're just trying to get most of it over to the civilian world. But we want to provide accurate AOA resources. We have a do-it-yourself HUD program if you're interested in head-up displays. We are the folks that develop the RV transition training resources. So if you're an RVer and you visit bands and you go to the safety page, I'm the guy that writes that book. And then we're going to work to get further into testing some of our AOA systems in a flight school environment so we can actually get some objective and subjective feedback from folks, both instructors and students. And we're always looking for feedback. And anybody can contribute, so there's resources to contact me on the website. So if there's something you like, something you don't like, something that we're getting wrong, something that we're getting right, just drop me a line and we're happy to course correct accordingly. Next slide. So today we're going to talk a little bit about this on-speed concept, just about listening to your AOA. We're going to talk about energy management. I'm going to try and reduce that to the most basic level I can because I know a lot of pilots aren't used to thinking in terms of managing energy. And then we're going to talk about what these simple AOA cues can do as far as allowing you to maximize the performance of your airplane to the extent that you can with only limited flight testing. Next slide. So I like to put this up at the beginning of the brief. This is really everything that you need to take away from this entire briefing, and that is there is one point in the drag curve, and drag is in quotes because if you're an engineer it's really a power required curve, and yes, the depiction is not 100% accurate, but there's one point in that curve where there's a maximum amount of thrust and a minimum amount of power required, and that point is referred to as on speed. And all you need to know is that if you're not on speed, you're either fast or slow compared to on speed. And we'll talk about that more later, and I'll show you some video examples, but it's about that simple. Next slide. Because I have a military background, I have a proclivity for using TLAs. A TLA is a three-letter abbreviation. I realize everybody does not speak back, which is my language. So if I talk about the word alpha, I mean angle of attack. If I talk about beta, I'm talking about yaw angle. If it's a kinetic parameter, I mean speed. Remember from junior high school, we have two kinds of energy, right? We have potential energy and we have kinetic energy. If I talk about a lift vector, I mean what direction is my lift pointing? So if I'm sitting in an airplane, the lift is generally pointing in the same direction as my head. If I bank the airplane, all I'm doing is rotating that vector. If I talk about a bore sight cue, I'm talking about where the airplane is pointed. So if you have ADI in your airplane, that's the little dot in the middle of the ADI. So it's where the airplane is pointed, but not necessarily where it's going, because where the airplane is going is the flight path or the velocity vector. And if you have an advanced display, that's the little thing that looks like Shrek's head on that display that tells you where the airplane is going. Next slide. Okay, we'll start off with the great airspeed versus AOA debate. And the fact is, it's not a debate. It just depends on where you are in the flight envelope. And this is the easiest way I can think to depict it. But if you take a basic flight envelope that everybody should be familiar with, this speed up here in the corner is maneuvering speed. It's also called corner velocity. They mean exactly the same thing. The expression corner velocity just comes from the fact that this diagram kind of looks like an open envelope, and this just happens to be a corner of the diagram. So So that's the origin of that. But if you're at a speed that's slower than maneuvering speed or current velocity, there is no airspeed or G limit on the airplane. There's only an aerodynamic limit. And this line right here is what? Anybody? Anyone? Bueller? Bueller? Yeah, it's your stall limit, right? So that's your critical angle of attack. Does that angle of attack ever change? Ever? No, it never changes. It's always the same angle of attack. So essentially, if I'm slower than maneuvering speed, what I care about is the aerodynamic limit of the airplane. If I'm faster than maneuvering speed, what I care about is either the airspeed or the G limit of the airplane, because I'm going to hit one of those two limits before I hit the aerodynamic limit. So that's really all there is to it. There isn't really a debate. AOA and airspeed are complementary concepts, even if you're operating just at 1G down in your normal takeoff and landing environment. We'll talk about that some more in just a bit. Next slide. Okay, so let's talk about angle of attack and what makes it so handy for what we're doing. The first thing is, angle of attack is always the same. It is not affected by G load, it is not affected by density altitude, it is not affected by gross weight. Okay, so your on-speed angle of attack, your LRD max angle of attack, your stall angle of attack, they are always the same. It doesn't matter if you're flying a J3 or a 747-800. That is true for any airplane. Okay? Now, indicated airspeed is affected by all of those parameters. And in our airplanes, in small airplanes, the biggest variable we fly, or face rather, is G. Okay? And that's a function of bank angle. Our gross weight margin, it just doesn't vary that much. CG and density altitudes are relatively consistent. The other thing I would bring up too when folks start to talk about airspeed is quick straw poll. Those of you that have an experimental airplane, how many of you guys in phase 1 tested for static source pressure error and know exactly what your indicated airspeed error is relative to calibrated airspeed? Show of hands. Yeah, that's pretty typical, okay? The neat thing is, about angle of attack, that's designed into the airplane. So we can do some cocktail napkin math for any airfoil and any airplane, and we can figure out what these angles of attack are. So really, what this angle of attack is good for is anytime you're in that left side of the diagram that we talked about, it tells you exactly where you are relative to the aerodynamic limit of the airplane. And if you have the right type of AOA system, and not all AOA systems are created equal, you can define some really important performance parameters. The two most important parameters are on speed, which is used for approach and landing. It also correlates with VX because it's your maximum thrust available. It's also maximum endurance glide. And LRD max, because LRD max correlates with best rate of climb, maximum range glide, and those are all very handy performance parameters. And again, it's completely independent of weight and G load. Next slide, please. Okay, here is everything you need to know about energy management in one slide, 3 bullets or less. Next slide. In very, very simple terms, all energy is power converted into airspeed and altitude. That's it. So there's 3 variables in the equation, and one of them is consistently changing, or they're all stable. Depends on the condition of flight. But energy, the easiest way to think about energy is just a kind of a 3-step ladder. You either have positive energy, which means you can climb or accelerate. You have negative energy, which means you can't climb or accelerate. Think of an airplane mushing, and no matter what you do with the power, it's going to continue to go down. Or think of an airplane in a high G turn, where you're already at maximum power, and no matter what you do, if you try to maintain that G load, the airplane is going to decelerate. Or you're at a magic point between those two, where your energy is neutral. So what we call this in fighters, for those of you that have that background, is P sub S, or excess specific power. And really, the equation is super simple. We're not going to do a whole lot of math today, but if you care, it's thrust times velocity minus drag times velocity divided by your weight. And you can cross out velocity, you just think of thrust and drag. So if thrust is greater than drag, your energy is going to be positive. If drag is greater than thrust, your energy is going to be negative. And if drag equals thrust, your energy is going to be neutral. So that's the first physics lesson. Something else that folks aren't always aware of, but when you are operating close to the ground trying to maneuver the airplane, it's not just simply a matter of keeping the airplane not stalled. It's also a matter of having sufficient energy on the airplane. You can be not stalled and decelerating and descending at the same time if you get too deep on the backside of the power curve. So it takes both of these things to maintain aircraft control at low altitude. And we'll be able to marry up the concepts using angle of attack and this on-speed concept in just a little bit. Next slide. So, what is the background on all this stuff? First, none of this work is original. None of the stuff that we do hasn't already been done before. The military has been using this since the 1950s. All the fighters that you hear flying around the pattern right now use these cues for both maneuvering and coming into approach and landing. We don't look at indicated airspeed. We do it once just to make sure the system is operating correctly. We get a warm fuzzy, and then we just transition to angle of attack for approach and landing. So it optimizes your energy both for approach and landing. It can be used to establish the special neutral energy standpoint of 0 p sub s. And then the other thing you'll find is if you actually can either hear your AOA or see your AOA, if you maneuver and maintain a constant AOA, your indicated airspeed is going to be all over the map because it's going to compensate for that kinematic parameter that you're trying to nail by substituting angle of attack. So again, these performance AOAs are always the same. I can't emphasize that enough. Next slide. So how can this improve your flying? Well, you can use it for takeoff and landing. On takeoff, on-speed cues are going to provide you best angle of climb, and LRD max is going to provide you best rate of climb. For landing, you're going to use it at VAP, and the difference between VAP and VApproach, or VREF rather, is there's no wind additive when you fly an angle of attack. You're just always flying the same angle of attack. And then for maneuvering, it's a real handy cue because it tells you that if you pull any harder than that angle of attack, what's going to happen to your energy? Yeah, you're losing it. You're going to go negative. All right? Next slide. All right, this is the last math, okay? And you don't even need to concern yourself with that. That's why I printed it in very light gray. But this is the physics behind on-speed. This is just a standard CL alpha curve that you had to study for your private pilot test. And all you really need to divine and get out of this math is the fact that that last ratio up there is VAP. It's the classic VS times 1.3 that everybody uses to start going, yep, my 1G approach speed at this weight is about here. And that's all there is to this. The difference is, by finding that point and nailing that angle of attack, that angle of attack never changes. That number, whatever it is, 9, 10, 11 degrees geometric, is always the same. Next slide. So what's faster, a truck or an A10? I would argue it's a truck. It's okay, laugh. We can have a good time. All right, so just to be honest, for any physicists or engineers in the audience, we have to talk about a power required curve anytime there's a propeller pulling the airplane through space. And power is just your thrust times your velocity. But a power curve doesn't always correlate directly with what we learned in pilot training, which we call a drag curve. But conceptually, the concepts are really the same, so you don't need to get too emotional about differentiating between the two. The other thing that you can take away from this is the angle of attack for LRD max, which is maximum lift to drag ratio, or minimum drag, is always going to be the same. And we know what that number is just by doing an analysis of the airplane. We can compute both on-speed and Carson's as a function of whatever that angle of attack is. So once we know LRD max, we know exactly where min power required is. We also know where Carson speed is, which is easiest to think of as best miles per gallon. Okay, next slide, please. So here's the caveman math behind all of this. Really, that's what that ratio looks like that was in the previous equation, and you can see it works out to 0.591. And and I'm a history major, so that's close enough to 0.6 for me. And essentially, the Goldilocks zone of where we're starting to look for on-speed when we figure it out is this between about 1.3 and 1.2 times the stall speed at 1G, and that's important, at 1G. Okay, so I did the math for everybody down here. If the stall is 63 miles an hour indicated airspeed, the on-speed band is going to be about 77 to 82. And that actually, in the real world, works out to about plus or minus a half degree angle of attack. And that rule of thumb, plus or minus half degree angle of attack, is relatively true for any airplane. So here's another important concept. Approach speed is actually a kinetic parameter. It's an energy parameter. It's not an AOA parameter. What we're doing is we're figuring out what AOA is associated with that at 1G, and we're always using that AOA because then the physics is really cool. That angle, whatever that angle is, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 degrees, is always the same and will compensate for changes in weight, density, altitude, and G. So it makes it really, really easy to fly. Next slide. Okay, here's another way of thinking about energy on a flight envelope. So we know this is the aerodynamic limit, we know this is the airspeed limit, and we know that this is the G limit up at the top. These aerodynamic parameters, angle of attack, they behave parabolically as a square of the airspeed, okay? So that's the science behind it. But what this is showing you is this on-speed parameter, this green band. Anywhere in the green band or in the green area of the envelope, your energy is going to be positive. The airplane has no trouble sustaining that point with the power available. If, however, you get above that, like this is my RV4, this is the VN diagram for my airplane. So if I was to be at 125 indicated and 4 Gs, that would put me right here. So you know what? I can't sustain that condition. I can get there, but then I'm just like a guy in an air show going straight up. How long can you maintain that zero airspeed straight up condition? For an instant. And then what happens? All that potential energy turns right back into kinetic energy. So anywhere in this part of the flight envelope, and that exists down at 1G, by the way, that's the backside of the power curve, okay? Your performance in that area is only instantaneous. You can't sustain it. So, no parking in the yellow zone. You can be there, but only for a short period of time before you got to start transitioning to a lower angle of attack, or a lower G, or a higher airspeed condition. Next slide. You don't have to worry too much about this chart, but I just like to throw it up real quick because what this shows is turn rate and turn radius for a particular airplane, in this case mine. But all airplanes have very similar characteristics to this, with the exception of fighters, where we try to marry these two up and get the maximum turn performance at the minimum amount of G. But the point is, this is sustained turn rate right here. This is instantaneous turn rate, and there's a big difference between what I can hold and what I can touch momentarily. So in my airplane, because RVs have a relatively low wing loading, relatively low drag, and a high power ratio, I can maintain about 2.5 or 3 Gs at about 105 knots, which is kind of L over D max, which is actually L over D max, at about 4,000 feet without any trouble. Okay, that means I got enough power to bank the airplane up and maintain those Gs and hold that turn. If I pull any harder, the airplane's going to slow down because then I'm starting to move into the yellow zone. So the red line just shows you the same thing the last diagram shows you in a different depiction. Next slide. Okay, what about flaps? We know from pilot training we had to study this chart, if anybody remembers it, okay? But this is just a CL, or coefficient of lift versus alpha plot. And when the airplane's clean, for any normal cambered airfoil, like the airplanes that we fly, it's going to be over here and it's going to shift to the left when we put flaps down. Okay, and it's going to shift to the left because the effective angle of attack starts to change, something we call absolute angle of attack. That's what the airplane sees. As pilots, we're trained to think about something called geometric angle of attack, which is the difference between the chord line and the relative wind. But what the airplane sees is the difference between the chord line and zero lift. And zero lift, depending on the airfoil, is over to the left side of zero angle of attack. Make sense? So zero lift for a cambered airfoil is actually negative. And if, show of hands for guys that have RVs. Okay, great. Your zero lift angle of attack for flap 0 is 1.2 degrees, negative 1.2 degrees. Any idea what it might be for flaps 40? Close to negative 20 degrees. Okay? So the absolute difference between that negative 20 degrees and stall is as much as 30 degrees. Well, we don't need to think about that. That's just what the airplane sees physically. We just think about geometric angle of attack, which is kind of more like the angle of attack you see when you look out the window and you figure out the difference between where the airplane's pointed and where the airplane's going. Next slide. All right, calibration. Next slide. We learned a lot beta testing last year, and there's a lot of angle of attack systems out in the market, and they vary from really good to really good stall warning indicators. So not all angle of attack systems are created equal, because how they are calibrated and how they do the angle of attack math is important, and where the sensor is located and what kind of sensor it is important. They all do stall warning great, but not all angle of attack systems can give you an LRD max or an on-speed key. So that's the first takeaway. The second takeaway is that a lot of folks, depending on their flying background, have a really hard time calibrating their system. No big deal, but if the system isn't calibrated, it's the classic garbage in, garbage out type of situation. So those two factors, the fact that there's a wide variance in performance, and then there's a relatively wide variance in how well these things are calibrated, means that not all AOA solutions are created equal. So AOA is not a cure for cancer. That's not what you need to take away from this brief. So if you already have an AOA system, show of hands, how many folks have an AOA system in their airplane? And the guys that have it, how many are confident that it's calibrated properly? That's cool. Awesome. Next slide. Okay, this is the way most systems are calibrated. Not all, but most. And this is kind of the physics behind it. The blue line is the slope of the lift curve. So remember, slope is rise over run from junior high school math. Okay? And if it's calibrated using a point down here at zero lift and some point prior to AOA getting all wacky around the stall, it pretty much can accurately capture that. If, however, it's calibrated using a stall and using some arbitrary low AOA point, you can see where the slope of those two lines is different. So the blue line is what the airplane actually is doing. The red line may be the calibration that you get out of your system. It just depends on how it works. So here's an example, something we learned using Dynan avionics. We used Dynan avionics for our first generation experiment. This is a perfect Dynan calibration. We found out that in nature, this doesn't exist. This was an experimental test pilot that got really lucky calibrating the system once. And he got it calibrated perfectly. I tried about 100 calibrations in the RV4, and we got 2 perfect calibrations out of 100 tries. So, next slide please, Lenny. This one is way more typical to what we see out there in the field for a Dynan calibration. But the neat thing is, the math still works out even with this calibration. Because this 60% number is really important on here. And all this chart is showing you is that this is 0% lift and this is 100% lift. And we just expect to see 100% lift after prior to stall. And 0% lift should be actually at 0 lift. Unless you have an algorithm that is smart enough to extrapolate that from some other options for calibrating your system. But What's neat though is that in this case, our pilot got 83% peak lift, flaps 40 in the stall. So the neat thing is the ratio still works. So 60% of the 83 is where we set an on-speed condition for him. That's cool. Next slide. So that just brings up a few points that if you decide to experiment with this, you actually have to verify it through flight tests to make sure that it's working for you. And then the other thing is it's even though we talk about 60% lift or we talk about 1.3 VS, those are where you start looking for this parameter. It's okay if in your airplane you decide you want to bias it up 2 knots or bias it down 2 knots. That's all right. None of this stuff is carved in stone. It's just where you need to start looking for it. And if you have a personal preference, if you want a little bit more energy on approach, well, that's great. You can go ahead and you can bias the actual band that you have adjusted for on-speed. So every day use something there. Every time I come into approach and land at 1G, I know about what indicated airspeed I'm looking for. So when I start to hear an on-speed cue, I cross-check that against my indicated airspeed. But once I know it's working, I can drop the airspeed out of my cross-check, if that makes sense. And then the other thing I like to point out to folks too, if you're not used to flying AOA, slow because you might have been flying too fast on final before, depending on what technique you were using. Next slide. So let's talk about just listening to your AOA and using your eyes for other things around the cockpit. I'm a big fan of an oral cue because it can be so helpful. And easy to sort out. That was a good oral cue. Next slide. Some video that shows you what's going on with the system. But you have to listen to it. So I'm not sure that's going to work with all the F110s in the pattern right now, but we'll see what happens. We'll play some of these videos, and I just point out, if you go to our website, all of these videos are on the website, along with all the educational materials. And if you click on any of the video links, it will take you to my channel on YouTube, and I've got, I don't know, 30 or 45 different videos on there that you can, thumb through and watch, and you can listen to this stuff in a more quiet environment. But this is the basic tone pattern. Our system uses. So the tone's going to start at LRD max. There are a series of slow beeps at 400 hertz, that's the frequency. And as you get slower and approach on speed, the beeps are going to get faster, closer together, until you're on speed, the tone just becomes solid. If you start to keep slowing down, or rather if you keep slowing down from that point, the frequency of the tone is going to change, the pitch, it's going to get high. It's going to go up to 1600 hertz, and it's going to start beeping again. And the beeps are going to get faster as you slow down. And if you get to about 5 knots of stall speed, or within about a degree of actual slow on attack, then the pulse rate's going to go up to about 20 pulses per second, and it's going to sound kind of like a stick shaker sounds in an airliner or a pellet shaker sounds in a fighter. So go ahead and play it, Lenny. Turn the volume all the way up. Oh. No. Why is it not playing? intentionally slow deceleration so you have a lot of time to listen to the tone. I know it's hard to hear in here. But right now I'm just slowing down to an on-speed condition. That's on-speed, solid tone. Slowing down, it's going to start to get a slow tone warning. So the way we talk about the tone is we talk about the solid tone as being on speed. We talk about the 400 pulse or the 400 hertz fast pulse per second as being slightly fast, and then the high frequency low rate beep as being slightly slow. It's really easy to hear both of these as you're flying the airplane. So it's very easy to make a small pitch correction to adjust your AOA back to on speed if you're coming into land. Next slide. So that brings us back to what we threw up here at the beginning of the I looked up the air show schedule today and go, oh great, the Raptor and the F-35 are flying at 2:30, brilliant. So again, everything just evolves down into this. On speed, slightly slow rather, slightly fast, slightly slow. Push is an overstatement. By push I really mean you just ease some pressure on the stick, right? And pull is probably a little bit of an overstatement as well, because by pull, what do I mean? I mean a nice soft squeeze on the stick to get back to the parameter that you want to be on as far as your pitch goes. Next slide. Okay, something else. This just shows you, I'm at idle power, so I've taken power out of the energy equation. All we have is airspeed and altitude, and I'm maintaining an on-speed condition throughout all of this. I'm just flying a constant angle of attack. Now you'll see me reverse once in a while. When I reverse, my angle of attack is going to obviously decrease momentarily, so the tone's going to change just a little bit. But the important thing to take away from this is watch how the indicated airspeed behaves. G-load, yeah, exactly. Yeah, G-load is a function of bank angle. Okay, so that's the difference. That's why airspeed is all over the map, anywhere from 65 indicated up to, you know, like about 105, 110 indicated. What I'm doing is I'm changing the G as I'm banking the airplane around. But the neat thing is I'm flying a constant angle of attack. My aerodynamic margin is always the same. And because I'm on speed, for whatever G-load I'm at, I'm getting an optimum energy trade-off between airspeed and altitude. Remember the diagram with the yellow no-fly zone? I'm on the green line in that diagram. I'm going down because my power's in idle, but I'm optimizing the rate that I'm going down for the G-load that I'm pulling. Can't make it much simpler than that. Next slide, please. And again, this is very similar, works throughout the whole flight envelope. So there's a slow tone area, there's a fast tone area, regardless of what G you're pulling. And then I just like to put this advertisement up here. A lot of us tend to think at 1G, but that is what gets people hurt in the traffic pattern. So if we start thinking a little bit more about 1, 2, and 3 Gs and how everything behaves in that region, it's a lot easier to conceptualize what's going on as we're making that base to final turn. Next slide. So this is just a high G demonstration, just a vertical turn, a loop, and how we apply this over the top, and then just a maximum performance turn, which was that red line on that turn rate radius diagram we looked at. Next slide. Okay, we'll watch it again. I'm fortunate my airplane has a low power loading, so it sustains G's pretty well at altitude. Next slide. Okay, so what we like to try to teach folks, part of the education piece of using this, if you have a properly calibrated AOA system and you know what this on-speed Q is, it's 60% lift, you can use it like a control instrument. Okay, so control instruments are our artificial horizon and our tacks. They tell us what to do with flight controls or throttles to, you know, achieve an objective. But we can use AOA to do the same thing once it stabilizes. All right, that tone provides all the pitch feedback I need as I'm flying a loop, I'm flying a high G turn, or I'm flying a base to final turn. It also provides trend information. That's why that, you know, that different logic with the 2 frequencies and the pulse rates is in there. And then, of course, if I'm in the slow speed regime up at the top with the high pitch tone, it provides good progressive stall warning just like any other AOA system. But it allows me to really clearly differentiate, okay, that's an LRD max condition, yep, that's an on-speed condition, yep, I'm right up against the aerodynamic limit. I can just hear all 3 of them while I'm flying. So why do we like sound? Well, this is the ergonomics behind it, besides the fact that I don't have to look in the cockpit. Because our hearing evolved before our seeing did, we hear more efficiently than we see. We actually process sound faster than we process visual cues. That's the plus side. Truth in advertising, the bottom or the downside is if we get really stressed out, what's the first sense that we tune out? Sound, right? So if there's a cop and the siren's blowing, you know, and you're not paying attention, or you hear a loud horn in the cockpit, but you manage to land gear up anyway. Oral cues are not perfect, but they're good. Next slide. So how does it help the pilot? Hopefully, you realize by now it simplifies energy management. All the good things that happen at on-speed are on this slide. You got basically optimum piece of S for turn performance. You got a VREF for approach and landing, and you don't have to worry about your G-load, you don't have to worry about your gross weight, you don't have to worry about your density altitude. Everything compensates for itself. So the real bottom line with flying on speed is, if you think about it, aerodynamically, there's never a reason as a pilot to pull any harder than on speed. Because if you do, you're just getting yourself into a negative energy state and you're starting to approach a stall. Now there's two exceptions to that rule. One is if you're trying to gun a bandit and you want to bleed off all your energy. And the other exception is if you're doing an emergency dive recovery close to the ground, where right now you're just simply trying not to die and you're going to max power and the buffet limit of the airplane, because that's the best you can do under those circumstances. But otherwise, for normal ops, there's really never any reason from an energy management perspective to pull any harder than on speed. And these cues make it really easy to not do that. Next slide. So we talked about this already. It's your VAP at 1G for approach and landing. It's the airspeed that you're used to seeing. And what it really does is it really allows you to hit that Goldilocks energy parameter just right. You're not too fast, you're not too slow for approach and landing. It also helps you by giving you an idea what your energy is simultaneously, which is really easy. So you actually get down into the flare with the right amount of energy. You're not going to float, okay, and you're not going to sink prior to that. So I like to advocate that, you know, once you transition to base and final, you just get your eyes up out of the cockpit and you start flying the airplane. And using this cue is a very easy way to do that. Next slide. As far as maneuvering flight goes, it's a great energy reference. It's also a great maximum performance AOA for sustained turn performance. If you do in fact find yourself transitioning outside of the flight envelope and want to get back into it, once you have established a low G condition and got out of whatever bad thing that you were in, then what you need to do is push the power up and transition to an on-speed cue to start climbing back up and regaining aircraft control. And if you do in fact get yourself into a stall or whatnot, it'll also help you avoid any sort of secondary stall condition, because it'll give you a slow cue and it'll tell you, hey dude, you are pulling too hard on the stick. Next slide. So these are the rules of thumb for using AOA as a performance parameter. For takeoff, on speed is going to provide the best angle of climb condition because it's maximum thrust. Elevate max is going to provide the best rate condition because it's maximum power available. From a maneuvering perspective, it's an optimum trade-off of power, thrust, and drag to at least minimize your turn radius and minimize your turn radius and maximize your turn rate. Thank you very much. And then for approach and landing, it's just optimum energy for coming into landing. So it serves a whole lot of purposes. Next slide. So we've been working on some things for energy management training for folks, and one of the ways that we think might be effective for doing that is to talk about what happens when the engine quits, because at that point we have a finite supply of energy, and our objective as a pilot is to use that wisely to get somewhere where we can get a mechanic to help us, or at least we can put the airplane down on the ground with nobody getting hurt, even if we start bending metal. So what this video is this is something that we call a V4 cut, because a V4 condition is an LRD max initial climb segment, but really this is just an engine failure at 250 feet AGL on takeoff from an LRD max condition. And all I'm doing is applying lift flaps, which are about half flaps in my airplane. And when I talk about lift flaps, I just mean a flap setting that gives you more lift than drag. So if the airplane you fly says use 10 degrees of flaps for takeoff, well that's a no lift flap condition. That's a great flap setting then if the engine quits, if you want to maximize your time aloft, to go to that setting. If you start to get more flap than that, in the case of an RV more than about 20 degrees, or 15 degrees if you got a 9 or a 10, well, then you're starting to get more drag than lift. So all I'm doing in this video is taking off, pulling the power back at 250 feet. I count to 3 to simulate the oh gosh time that is going to be associated with your engine really quitting on takeoff, because none of us are going to react instantaneously. And then I'm applying lift flaps, or 20 degrees of flap in the case of my airplane. And I'm slowing to an on-speed condition. I'm turning back around and I'm landing on the TDZ that I want to touch down at for the opposite runway. Lenny?
Bravo, depart runway 9. Simulated engine failure and takeoff. Medium route 27. Sky park.
That's just a lousy video. I don't have a blip switch in my RV4. Because we're doing so much flight test, I actually have the tone set to come on at 0 knots, so I listen to it backwards on takeoff. There's a minimum speed setting that you can set so that you don't have to listen to it on takeoff if you don't want to. Would you stop for just a second? Let it catch up? Yeah. We're just going to let the hard drive catch up with itself because you'll be able to hear things better if it does.
On speed.
That's probably the best example I can give of energy management without getting too complicated. And I'm not advocating everybody go out and practice 200-foot turnbacks. That's going to be highly aircraft dependent. Has a lot to do with the drag characteristics of the airplane and everything else. And I just put that up there as an example of what this kind of technology allows you to do. And fairly simply, because I'm really not that good a pilot. All I have to do is listen to that tone. I can do whatever I want with the airplane, whatever I want with the banking. As long as I maintain that tone, I know I've got an absolutely optimal energy condition, and I'm doing the best I can trading whatever airspeed and altitude I have available for glide performance to get back to the runway. So it makes it pretty simple. And that is actually all we have in the brief. So